Hi there. This is Tom Aaron of Fetch Masters Dog Training in Denver, Colorado, and host of Positive Gun Dog Training Pro, an online community dedicated to helping you train your hunting dog without the use of heavy-handed techniques or equipment. Let's get started. Welcome to episode 3 of our videos in general for the Positive Gun Dog Training Pro group, which also happens to be the third part of our Positive Trained Retrieve series. Today, what I would like to discuss is the difference between forced fetching and the Positive Trained Retrieve. And I would also like to begin demonstrating how to train our version, the Fetch Masters version of the Positive Trained Retrieve, which we use as an alternative to forced fetching. If you're a member of the Positive Gun Dog Pro community, you will be able to watch everything. If you're not a member of Positive Gun Dog Training Pro, you will be able to watch the first part of this video, the discussion on the differences between forced fetching and the Positive Trained Retrieve, but not the second part, the demonstration of the Positive Trained Retrieve, which is going to be broken down into numerous parts as well because it's kind of a lengthy process, just like forced fetching. So if you're not a member of the group, please go over to www.positivegundogtraining.com and sign up. We would love to have you there. It's a friendly group, and we're learning a lot, and a lot of content is getting posted. Anyway, the first thing I would like to discuss about forced fetching is this. If you go online and you Google forced fetching, you're going to come up with a lot of websites that all say forced fetching is the only way to guarantee a reliable retrieve to hand. This statement is incorrect on a number of levels. First of all, I do not care how you train a dog, whether it's with a shock collar or with the best treats you can find, nothing guarantees anything. There is no such thing as 100% reliable. You are not 100% reliable. Your computer is not 100% reliable. The electricity going to your house is not 100% reliable. Some things are more reliable than others, but nothing is foolproof. So the notion that forced fetching guarantees anything is flat out incorrect. And the same thing could be said for the Positive Trained Retrieve. The next thing I would like to say about this myth that forced fetching guarantees a reliable retrieve to hand is this. There are numerous ways to train a dog to retrieve to hand. And in the positive dog training world, we have a ton of those. So forced fetching is not the only way to guarantee a reliable retrieve to hand. There are other ways to develop a retrieve to hand that is very, very reliable. Thus, this video on the Positive Trained Retrieve. However, the thing to understand about that statement, that forced fetching guarantees a reliable retrieve to hand, you need to understand the history of dog training or hunting dog training and forced fetching. When that statement came about, forced fetching was the closest thing you could get to a reliable retrieve to hand, or to guaranteeing that. And the reason is because the alternative to forced fetching was not a Positive Trained Retrieve. The alternative to forced fetching was an instinctive retrieve. And an instinctive retrieve is fundamentally flawed. The reason it's flawed is this. Instinct, for our purposes here, is essentially a really, really deep feeling, okay, that you should do something. When you toss a bumper for a dog that has good retrieving instinct, it really, really feels like it needs to go get that bumper and bring it back to you. That's an instinctive retrieve. But what happens when it goes out and gets that bumper and it comes back towards you to bring that bumper and it sees a rabbit run? What is going to happen? Is that dog going to instinctively say, well, I'm not going to chase the rabbit, I'm going to come straight to you? Or is it going to say, bring the bumper back to Tom, bring it back, ooh, rabbit, and be out of there? The second one, most likely. Instincts / feelings are subject to change as the environment changes. If a dog feels like he should do something, it's not a big leap for 2 seconds later for him to feel like he should do something else. So an instinctive retrieve is really not great for hunting. Some of you out there might say, well, I have a dog and I've never trained him to retrieve and he does great. Good for you. That's some very, very good instinct, but that is not typical of hunting dogs in general. So anyway, force fetching does not guarantee a reliable retrieve to hand. The statement is just flat false, but when they said it, they were comparing it to an instinctive retrieve, and in that sense, they were fairly accurate. So now what I want to talk about is what is the strength of force fetching? What makes force fetching better than an instinctive retrieve? It's important for us to understand that so that you can also understand the power of the positive trained retrieve. First and foremost, the power of forced fetching lies in the fact that it actually trains a sequence of events that dog is to execute. It gives that dog an instruction set. Move from me out to the bumper, grab the bumper, come straight back to me, sit, hold the bumper in your mouth till I put my hand out and take it. Bam. Now, not only does the dog feel instinctively like it should retrieve, but it knows exactly how you want that to happen. And just knowing what you want, given the fact that most dogs do have a cooperative streak, just knowing what you want ups the reliability of the retrieve. It also ups the likelihood that the dog will keep the bird in his mouth until you get it in your hand. So one of the largest powers of force fetching is the fact that it is a trained retrieve. It is an instruction set that explains to the dog exactly what it is supposed to do. So is a positive trained retrieve. It has the same power, right? When you train a retrieve positively, the sequencing of how you train that, at least the way we train it, the sequence of how that is done is not radically different from forced fetching. We teach the dog to put something in its mouth on command. We teach the dog to move straight out, come straight back, hold something in his mouth until you get your hand on it. So the dog receives a very similar instruction set. So this power that force fetching has in providing an instruction set, the positive or trained retrieve has that as well, right? Both are trained retrieves, not instinctive retrieves. When trained correctly, instinct merges with training and you end up with a more reliable maneuver, if you will. Now that we've talked about how force fetching and the positive trained retrieve are similar and that they both create an instruction set, let's talk a little bit about how they are different. The primary difference between the two is in what motivates the dog to execute the retrieve. Now in force fetching, the dog is motivated by wanting to avoid a punishment. That punishment is pressure. Early in the force fetching process, the dog is motivated because he wants to avoid that ear pinch, or more accurately, he wants to get you to let go of that ear pinch as soon as possible. So he does what he does to make the pressure or pain or force or whatever you want to call it go away. He's avoiding, it's an avoidance behavior in a sense, right? He's avoiding discomfort by executing a retrieve. That is the motivating factor of force fetching. The motivating factor of the positive trained retrieve is different. Now, for those of you that think, well, the motivating factor for a positive trained retrieve is treats, not the way we do it. It's motivated by retrieving drive. So we have very specific exercises that we do with the dog to take its retrieving drive and build it higher and higher and higher. Because the more that dog wants to retrieve, the less need there is to force that dog to retrieve. So at Fetch Masters, we put a very high significance on building retrieving drive. So the dog is retrieving in positive trained retrieving because he loves it. Now, some of you may say, my dog was force fetched, but he loves to retrieve. He doesn't need a shock collar to retrieve. He just loves it. I've seen that many times, and I agree with you. There's many dogs like that, but here's what I would suggest. That dog does not love retrieving because of forced fetching. That dog loves retrieving in spite of being forced fetched. He loves retrieving because genetically he's wired to love retrieving, or you've made retrieving extremely fun for the dog in the past, and for whatever reason he loves it. But he does not love something because he was trained to do something to avoid punishment. He loves it because he loves it. And that's an important factor to understand, because I have seen a lot of dogs with mediocre retrieving drive go into force fetching and flunk out. They flunk out of the force fetching part, and then they end up coming to us, and we do a positive trained retrieve to help them to love retrieving again, because the whole concept of making the dog retrieve to avoid pressure or punishment or whatever, that whole concept has a side effect. And for some dogs, that side effect is it decreases retrieving drive, it decreases the joy of retrieving, and sometimes it even makes the dog loathe retrieving. So positive trained retrieving is a different thing, right? We build joy in retrieving. You can go back to our first episode and listen to the video where we talk about how to build retrieving drive. But we build this retrieving drive and then tie that into the technique, the trained retrieve. So the motivating factors of the two are vastly different. Who's to say which one is stronger? On the one hand, with forced fetching, if you don't put a shock collar on your dog, you know that for a very large portion of those dogs, maybe not all of them, but for a very large portion of those dogs, they are going to lose their motivation. They know when a shock collar's on them and when it's not. And if there's something else they would rather do, you start losing control if you no longer have the punisher in place. We have less of that issue with a positive trained retrieve, because if a dog loves retrieving, it just loves retrieving, right? It's not dependent on a treat that you have in your pocket. It's not dependent on anything except for the joy of retrieving. So we have less of the need for equipment with the positive trained retrieve. Now, some of you are going to say, if the positive trained retrieve is so good, how come there's no field trial champions? First off, that's probably not true anymore. There's more and more stories that we're seeing come through our social media channels of people saying, hey, you just won this award or that award, and my dog's positively trained. So mind share is changing on this, and people are trying it. But I will say this, the best field trial dogs still are dogs that were force fetched. However, positive gun dog training is a very new thing in the world. It has not been around for very long. So honestly, we're still in our infancy. We're still waiting for people to learn this craft and be very active in field trials and see what they can do. But I suspect that once that happens, you're going to start to see a lot more dogs that are positively trained. Okay, now that we have talked about that, let's talk for a moment about the limitations of the two methodologies. With forced fetching, you really have a couple of limitations. The first one is that e-collar. Some field trials and hunt tests, you cannot have an e-collar on your dog. And if the dog is moderately intelligent, there's a good chance that that dog will figure out, hey, the collar's not on me. I can do whatever the heck I want. I've seen it happen before, and so have you. So you know it's possible. The next limitation of it is that whenever you use punishers to train a dog, you typically have to use a fairly intense level of punishment. Otherwise, the dog will toughen up to it. And then you'll have to up your intensity, then the dog will toughen up, then you have to up your intensity, then the dog will toughen up. And at some point, if you're not careful, you'll get a dog that will blow through that e-collar. I've seen dogs blow through e-collars running after rabbits. I've seen dogs blow through e-collars running after deer. Punishers have limitations. So those are the two big drawbacks I see to forced fetching. The positive train retrieve has limitations too. The drive level, the retrieving drive level of all dogs can't be trained up to some superbly high invincible level. All dogs don't have the genetic makeup for that. Some dogs enjoy other things more than they do retrieving. And if something pops up in the field that the dog finds more rewarding to chase after than it finds to retrieve that bumper, you're going to start losing reliability. The one good thing is that when you do train a dog to a very high drive level, reliability is not dependent on how far that dog is away from you. If it loves retrieving whether it's 10 feet away or 100 feet away. Another point I would like to make is this. The use of negative reinforcement to train a dog to retrieve is not reserved only for forced fetching. It's used heavily throughout traditional gun dog training. And it's the equivalent of telling humans that the beatings will continue until morale improves, right? The pressure on your ear or the stimulation from the shock collar will continue until you do what you're supposed to do. That's negative reinforcement. As humans, we don't like living under those circumstances. And I'm personally convinced dogs don't care for it much either. With positive training, the mentality is different. The mentality is, if you do what I ask, you will get what you want. And isn't that the same sort of dynamic you like to work under? You go to work and your boss says, if you do X, Y, and Z this week, you get your paycheck. So anyway, there are some thoughts about force fetching versus the positive train retrieve.